Alright, let's talk about the Opium Wars. But first, we have to set the stage for what led up to it, and to do that, we've got to start at America's mother's house, Great Britain. Now, Great Britain loved that Chinese tea, and in order to get it, they created a three-country trade agreement. They would trade cotton from India and silver from Great Britain for other goods that were produced in China. And for a while that worked. But the British, being who they were, got greedy. You see, they loved everything the Chinese produced, from their silks to their porcelains to their tea. And they kept wanting more and more. And because of that, they had to pay more in silver. But the British didn't have anything that the Chinese wanted. As British demands for Chinese imports rose, demands for British imports fell, because ain't nobody in China want that stuff. So in the late 1700s, the British, being who they were, decided to switch Indian cotton for Indian opium. Since we don't produce anything you want, we'll get you hooked on something we've got. Sound familiar? The Opium Wars, Part 2. By the 1820s, the roles of power reversed, and it was now the Chinese who were paying the British in silver. Now, opium is made from the sap of the poppy plant, and it has been used medicinally and recreationally in the Eastern world for centuries. After British colonized large parts of India in the 1700s, they created the British East India Company to do business with East Asia. The British became so successful in the opium trade that they became the monopoly in the cultivation and distribution of it. They were the freeway Rick Ross of opium. Now, by the early 19th century, more and more Chinese started using opium recreationally. And because of that, they felt the negative effects when they tried to stop. Withdrawals, body aches, chills, some even died. And once addicted, people would do just about anything to get some opium. Sound familiar? Now, the Chinese government saw this as a problem, and by the year 1800, completely banned opium altogether. The Opium Wars, Part 3. By the year 1813, the Chinese government took it a step further, banning the smoking of opium, and if they caught you smoking it, you got 100 lashes. And that just pissed the British East India Company off. How dare you try to protect your people from the drugs that we've given to them? So instead of respecting the wishes of the Chinese government, they hired American and British smugglers to smuggle in more opium, because the Chinese had no rights that they were bound to respect. Sound familiar? Now, these smugglers stationed themselves off the coast of Guangzhou, and by the 1830s, there were so many Chinese smugglers that the price of opium actually dropped. The British lost their monopoly on opium, but the Chinese never stopped using it. In fact, they increased their usage. In 30 years, they went from importing 4,500 chests of opium to over 40,000. The more opium used by the people of China meant they had to shell out more silver. Part 4. In 1836, the Chinese government got serious about their 1813 ban on opium. So they went through closing all opium dens and executing opium dealers. Sound familiar? So the Chinese emperor called on Chinese officials to have a debate on the best way to handle this opioid epidemic. And that meeting boiled everything down to two sides. One side argued we should focus on the user and not the dealer. They argued that opium should be legalized and heavily taxed by the government. They thought if you made it so expensive, people wouldn't use it, and then you could use the taxes to fund the government. Sound familiar? Now, the other side strongly disagreed with that approach, and they were led by a man named Lin Zuxi, who wanted to punish the pusher man, saying that this was a moral issue, an evil that needed to be stopped, because if not, we'd have no students, no taxpayers, and no soldiers, and this would leave us defenseless. Part 5. In the end, Lin Zuxi's side won the argument, tongue twister, and in 1839, he personally supervised the crackdown on opium. He even wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking her about the morality of a foreign power selling drugs to another country. Sound familiar? The progress he made on the ban of opium was swift. Thousands of dealers were arrested. Tens of thousands of opium pipes were destroyed. He even demanded that the British turn over their supplies of opium in exchange for tea. Well, the British didn't want to do that, so Lin Zuxi was like, you know what? No trade for nobody, and he locked down everything, and if you were a foreign merchant, you couldn't leave. Well, after being held in place for 6 weeks, the British finally gave in and turned over 2.5 million pounds of opium, and Lin Zuxi destroyed it all. And that pissed the British off. After Lin Zhuxi and them destroyed over 2.5 million pounds of opium, he then went and seized and destroyed the drugs on the British ships. And that pissed the British off even more. How dare you destroy the drugs on our ships? We were parked in international waters. Lin Zhuxi had to inform the British officials that you are not parked in international waters. You're parked around Chinese islands. Oh, these are yours? They should be ours. Lin Zhuxi then set his sights on the Portuguese, because they was doing shady stuff too. So after putting pressure on the Portuguese, the British were finally expelled to the island of Hong Kong. How dare they tell us what to do in their own country, Mom? This is an affront to our dignity. We shall have satisfaction. And at that moment, the first Opium War was born. The destruction of all that opium was worth millions of pounds of sterling silver. And when merchants in China, India, and London realized that their profits had been destroyed, that gave British politicians enough reason to go to war. We shall now expand our British imperial interests in China. And in November 1839, Chinese warships collided with British merchantmen. In June of 1840, 16 British warships and merchantmen showed up to Huangzhou, and for the next 2 years, battles erupted everywhere. The British destroyed their forts, captured cities, and even tried negotiations. Now, the Chinese did their absolute best to defeat the British, but their weapons were old and outdated, and they didn't have many warships. So they reached a settlement. China would cede Hong Kong to the British, pay indemnity or reparations to the British, grant them full diplomatic relations. The First Opium War ended in 1842 with the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing. Now keep in mind, all the Chinese officials who signed this treaty did so at gunpoint. Here's what the British forced Chinese officials to sign. You've given us Hong Kong, and now we demand an excellent deep water port there. We demand reparations to all British citizens. You will give us 5 treaty ports at Guangzhou, Shanghai, Xiaomin, Ningbo, and Fuzihao. These are now places that belong to British merchants and their families. Will also give us extraterritoriality in these ports, meaning anyone living there is subject to British rule, not Chinese. And any rights that you give to a foreign nation shall automatically be granted to us as your most favored nation. Boy. This proved to be a very substantial loss to the Chinese government. The Qing dynasty exiled Lin Zhuxi, and dozens of Chinese officers committed suicide. Signing that treaty did absolutely nothing positive for the people of China. Now, the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing ended the Canton system that had been in place since the 1700s. This was followed up by unequal treaties in 1844 that favored the Western world. Sound familiar? Now get this, that most favored nation clause allowed Westerners to build churches and introduce Christianity to China. I told you why Jesus was used as a political tool to spread white supremacy. After its peak in 1879, all imports of opium began to decline, and it stopped altogether at the beginning of World War I. In 1850, the Chinese emperor died, and his successor did his best to bring Lin Zhuxi out of exile. He died along the way. And now we've come to the Second Opium War. In October of 1856, Chinese authorities arrested Chinese citizens who were working for the British. And the British used this as a way to force China to open itself even more to the Western world. It's like being bent over a barrel and you're spread as far as you can, and the person behind you is still yelling wider. And when China executed a French Christian missionary, the French used this as an excuse to help the British invade China. In 1860, British and French troops invaded Beijing. The Chinese tried to negotiate, but the British High Commissioner to China ordered troops to invade the imperial palace and destroy everything. After that, the emperor left. His brother orchestrated the Convention of Beijing and signed another treaty ceding 2 places to the British, including Hong Kong. The Chinese refer to these wars as a century of humiliation, saying if you're backward, you'll take a beating.